So today I would like to explore what trauma-based and social psychology-based approaches can tell us about obstacles to healing and reconciliation, and also ways of overcoming these. And obviously it's a very, very broad topic and a very complex field, so I'll only really be touching on some ideas of how I think these themes connect with each other. So also when I talk about both areas, I will not go into detail about the whole areas, but I will just talk about the intersection of these areas. So just to give I might have to turn around while I'm talking just to check I'm on the right slide. So just to give a brief overview, so I will be focusing on the context of intergroup conflict, because this is particularly relevant to group identities. And social psychology offers a lot of different ideas and theories on intergroup conflict. I would just like to mention maybe one in this context, which is the social identity theory by Thaden and Turner, which uses the idea or proposes the idea that sort of belonging of a group is interlinked with sort of also the kind of will or the attempt to uphold this group identity. And also intergroup conflicts can also be associated with wanting to kind of strengthen a group's identity. There are also other theories which relate more to fights over resources and so on, but I won't be able to go into further detail in this at this point. So talking about reconciliation, I chose to sort of use the concept of Bloomfield because I feel it's quite broad, and it's also, in my opinion, applicable to healing, in that it's a process of a division of groups towards coming together or having a shared future, and I think this concept is also very relevant to healing. Again, for definitions of trauma, I chose to present you with quite broad concepts, because I won't be talking about clinical approaches here, but more about a sort of social community context. So I felt that Herman's definition of traumatic events is really relevant, because it also talks about like the lack of control or the loss of connection and meaning that's associated with traumatic events. And it also touches on this complete sense of helplessness that people who experience traumatic events often talk about. Then I chose, I know there were a lot of conversations about collective traumas and the collective trauma and the concepts of that. I've chosen a more sort of a concept that's more placed in the social context. So Erickson, he talks about collective trauma as trauma that sort of is associated with a blow to the tissue of community. So in that sense, it's really something that happens in the social context. And that's not just a concept or a narrative, but it's also something that is sort of associated with the breakdown of social identity that people might have as part of a community. Due to time constraints, I will just really highlight a few points which are obstacles to a peaceful future. I know the field is very, very broad, and it's very hard to conceptualize in a very short amount of time. But I feel these particular points relate to both identity and also the impact of trauma. So one part of the impact of traumatic events relates to the social environment. So connections, for example, if violence takes place in the space of communities, this conflict between groups destroys the social fabric or the social togetherness that existed before. So, for example, people who might have been neighbors before suddenly are fighting on the opposite sides of fighting against each other. And the communities that existed before just don't exist in the same way anymore. And also, at the same time, this lack of, or this loss of the previous communities is also associated with, there's not the same sense of meaning anymore, and also there's no trust towards, into a safe community in the same sense anymore. And also this can relate to also the social identity. So the social identity that might have been there as part of a community doesn't exist in the same way after a conflict anymore. Also the emotional impact is dramatic. For example, if people, especially on a large scale level, are exposed to traumatic events, it can really impact the sense of integrity or safety, or also, and then a response can also be a huge loss, grief, fear, anger, shame. And also there's often a fear, as Drozdek, I believe is the pronunciation, as he highlights, is also then a sense of not wanting to confront the wounds, or really a sense of vulnerability, and this can be a huge challenge to addressing trauma, which I will come to later, again, to talking about healing. So in terms of, so there's the emotional and social impact, but then sort of the ideas of social psychology, I feel, come in when it comes to the narratives and beliefs that support the group identity. So, for example, Bartal, he talks about a sense of collective victimhood, which I feel is also related to ideas of social identity theory, which talk about groups try to promote their own group as more favorable than the other group. So in a sense, the sense of collective victimhood that then places a group in a sort of position where they're the victim and they're not responsible for what happened, but they're defined by the sense of victimhood. And also, I suppose, the experience of the trauma amplifies this sense of victimhood, because it's really related to a sense of helplessness, and you have been, it's a reality that exists. It's not just a concept, and if it's shared by a big group of people, it's also a reality that exists. But where identity sort of comes in is where this division, where it leads to further division then by just defining your group as the victim, not the other group. And this also relates to the idea of competitive victimhood. And then, people mentioned it already in the previous days, there's also then the aspect of transgenerational trauma, which there are many theories of explaining it, but one of the aspects relates to the idea of chosen traumas, which was proposed by Volkan. And he says that so narratives about events after a while become part of the group identity. They're not just a narrative anymore, and also they're kind of becoming independent of the event. And so chosen traumas, at certain points in history, they might be dormant, but actually much later there can be periods where these traumas again are in a way chosen to support certain political narratives or certain ideas that might also promote further division or even promote conflict at a later point. I actually just realized I forgot to move on in my slide. Basically, when I was thinking about these concepts, I tried to think of a way of how I could visualize the ideas and how I could visualize how these different concepts interlink. And obviously, what I propose here, it's just a diagram of the way I was thinking about it. It's very hard to put this into any diagram, I feel. But basically, what I want to show through this diagram is that sort of emotions, beliefs, and narratives seem to be the interlinking factors between both the sort of group identity and collective trauma. So intergroup conflicts will be, motivated by certain divisions between different groups, and then following the conflicts, other factors come in: emotions, beliefs, and narratives that were nurtured throughout the conflict, kind of come together with the impact of the trauma. And that, again, the sense of collective trauma can, again, motivate certain emotions or certain emotional climate, or can motivate certain beliefs of threat through the other group, or narratives of being victimized and so on, which further divide groups, different groups. So it's kind of then a situation which is very hard to resolve. And so as the second part of my presentation, I would like to talk about some ideas you might get from this combination of approaches. So one of the things that, for example, Hermann talks about in her book Trauma and Recovery is the importance of creating safe spaces. And, how many minutes do I have? Just okay, great, okay. So it might relate to safe inner spaces, but also outer spaces. So that could include, for example, on a very basic level, community initiatives of bringing people together and sort of starting to create a space where people maybe on a small level start to feel safe again. Could also be women's groups, or I feel it also includes a sense of economic stability or a sense of social stability which kind of extends from the community level. So it's sort of a catch-22, because I suppose people, in order to heal from trauma, for example, Hermann says you need a safe space, but at the same time also group divisions are associated with a sense of insecurity. So it's very hard to kind of find the breaking point where you start to trust again, or where you kind of establish a sense of safety. So I feel it can't really happen at a very quick rate, and not in the beginning, not at an intergroup level, but sort of small changes in changing community relationships might be part of this change in promoting a sense of safety, of social safety. And also rebuilding relationships plays into that. And also a lot of research suggests that one of the highest factors, or the greatest factor in healing from trauma is social relationships. So people who have a good social network are much more likely to heal effectively. Or, healing is a very difficult term, but are to recover in that sense. But again, at a mass sort of level of trauma, this can be a very difficult process, because maybe this social support that might be available to just, on an individual level of trauma might not be so readily available if a large number of people have been affected by the trauma. And often people can be quite preoccupied with their own fate, which is very natural it's very hard to move beyond that state. So part of that then also includes overcoming divisions between groups if really an effective reconciliation should take place. So again, social contact also plays an important role in this context. For example, some research by Spahić, who teaches here in Sarajevo, she has done a lot of research on intergroup conflict, and also found that this seems to be, in fact, a factor that's associated to some degree with increase of empathy, and also other research highlights the role of dialogue in bridging, sort of in rehumanizing also the other group. And also one example is when I looked at different projects, I found the Parent Cycle, which is an Israel and Palestine project where parents who from both sides who experienced great loss decided to come together and share their stories of grief with each other, and in that sense sort of bridge the group division of it's just our grief or it's just their grief, but it's something that affects both groups from both sides, actually. And also there's a potential for a beneficial emotional climate, like vulnerability. It doesn't have to mean that there's just negative emotion, but it might also be a turning point or a point where there's a certain space for a more positive emotional environment when something changes, for example, on a political sphere. For example, Hutchinson, she talks about how kind of trauma and politics might come together, and actually where there's always a potential for a negative turn if politicians or the general sort of mainstream of media or narratives goes into that direction, but there's also always a potential for positive change if there are if this situation is used in the right way. This relates to challenging negative narratives or beliefs or emotions, which is very challenging, but it seems to be that what research suggests that it needs to happen from both a grassroots level and some sort of top-down level. If not both happens, it's very difficult for any lasting change to be sustainable, for change to be sustainable. Some ideas of promoting positive narratives can be some youth forums or also promoting peace-supporting narratives as part of youth initiatives, especially young people, I feel, need to be involved in this work because those are the people who carry the narratives to the next generation. And also, for example, there are ways of how communities can use storytelling as a resource as well, and storytelling in that sense can both serve as changing narratives about a traumatic event, but it can also actually have a healing impact, as we heard before. Narrative approaches to trauma healing can be very effective. So again, I tried to sort of bring these ideas into the diagram I showed you before. Again, there are a lot more factors that could go into it, but I just highlighted some of it. So a sense of safety is likely to change some of the emotions people might feel, or people might feel more ready to address some challenging emotions or belief because they feel they have a safe space. And then again, this also, of course, everything connects. Emotions, beliefs, and narratives are all very interlinked, and they're very hard to separate. And also relationships that sort of the idea of dialogue relates to relationships, or the idea of building community groups. All that again can change emotions and beliefs about each other or about the situation. And to me also that the use of community resources is particularly also important in creating a sense of empowerment and also a sense of safety or agency. And again has an impact on the emotional level or beliefs and narratives, and so also I feel can be both beneficial to changing the group identities, but also to promoting some healing of trauma. So really, I just shared some ideas of ways how these approaches could be used to inform each other, and I suppose I find that these factors. If you look at the literature, a lot of the literature looks either at identity or at trauma, but I feel there could be much more of an interlink of these two approaches, and because they're interlinked and there are many things they share with each other. Again, whenever talking about these concepts, there's no one way of solving any of these complex issues, and it's always important to be aware of the social context and the environment.
Thank you.